Okay, the thing is, usually when I teach the part about Englishness and Britishness, I start off with showing you a few examples. And one of my favorite examples is the opening of the Olympic Games in 2012. So usually I'd be starting with The Tempest, narrated by Kenneth Branagh, while rural England is moving through the Industrial Revolution to some sort of modern England. I would be showing you the part about the NHS, about English literature, about children's literature, and so on and so forth. And I would be asking you, which identity do you think is represented here? And what are the cornerstones of the identity that is presented in this opening of the Olympic Games? And if we're talking about Englishness and Britishness, I would also be asking you, what do you think are the cornerstones of either Englishness or Britishness? And if there are any, where would you draw the line between Englishness and Britishness? And usually the answers I get are somewhat along the lines of, well, there is the Industrial Revolution, which is definitely a British development that started in England. Or the landscape that is presented is England, or, well, England that is part of Britain, of course. And the NHS, yes, that's an English or British, English invention, but the portrayal of it is certainly British. After all, it represents different ethnicities, and that is certainly British. And while there are a number of answers I usually get, what all of them, or at least most of them, usually boil down to is one problem, that every time we talk of Britain, we inevitably also talk of England. And every time we speak of England, we, without a doubt, speak of Britain. And possibly in our heads, we inflate one with the other and refer to them somewhat synonymously, being at times unable to differentiate where England ends and where Britain begins, and of course vice versa. And looking back at the examples we've already talked about, it's notable that all of them, from Lord of the Rings to Harry Potter to The Crown, portray what we perceive as Englishness, which is maybe not too surprising because this seminar that you are taking is of course called Fantastic England and not Fantastic Britain or Fantastic Four Nations. And yet it is important to mention that neither nation, neither England nor Britain can be easily distinguished, both maybe in the way we talk about it and we imagine it, but also in the way it is represented on screens. And that is not to mean that there are no British symbols in films or series. After all, the Union Jack as a symbolic unifier is often put on display, either directly in the foreground or more implicitly in the background. And yet, what we see as Britishness is often directly tied to Englishness, while Englishness has become a metonymy for the entirety of Britain. And this is not only a problem that we're facing, we as foreigners. In 2015, David Cameron called for promoting British values in school, noting that we need to be far more muscular in promoting British values and the institutions that uphold them. And while he noted that sex segregation in schools should be abandoned and religious openness in Britain celebrated, he also emphasized that children from all backgrounds should be taught about the Magna Carta, saying that the document established the rule of law and paved the way for parliamentary democracy. Now, this is a rather odd choice, to be fair. On the one hand, Cameron's comment is based on class elitism, on monarchy and on tradition. As Owen Jones has commented, there is a history of Britain that is about empire, aristocracy, monarchy, the established church, exploitative employers, and so on. The Tory view of history is founded on the myth of a benevolent elite granting carefully managed change of goodwill and generosity. On the other hand, his choice of the Magna Carta is odd in the sense that the Magna Carta is an English rather than a British historical document, a document that is concerned with the power of nobility in relation to the monarch, not the rights of the majority of the population who were directly excluded from such a document. This choice, however, also shows that the intertwinement between England and Britain is not only something that foreigners do, rather it is a choice that testifies to the imperial reach of the English, both at home and abroad. A reach that also tells us about the difficulties that most English people have of distinguishing themselves in a collective way from the other inhabitants of the British Isles. This is, however, not always the case. In fact, there are particular exceptions to the general rule, which is to see all major events and achievements of national life as English. In his Modern English Usage, Fowler stresses that we and the English usually speak of the British Commonwealth, of the British Navy, or the British trade, and they, in this case the British, also boast that Britons never shall be slaves. Fowler notes, but it must be remembered that no Englishman calls himself a Briton without a sneaking sense of the ludicrous, or hears himself referred to as a Britisher without squirming. How should an Englishman utter the words Great Britain with a glow of emotion that goes for him with England? His sovereign may be Her Britannic Majesty to outsiders, but to him is the Queen of England. He talks the English language. He has been taught English history as one continuous tale from Alfred to his own day. He has heard of the word of an Englishman and aspires to be an English gentleman. And he knows that England expects every man to do his duty. In the word England, not in Britain, all these things are implicit. It is unreasonable to ask 40 millions of people to refrain from the use of only names that are in tune with patriotic emotion, or to make them stop and think whether they mean their country in a narrower or in a wider sense every time they name it. This does tell us a little about Englishness and its relation to Britishness, of course. This, however, all just describes rather than explains the hows and whys. Why, given the objective situation of a multinational state, did Britain and Britishness not gain more traction? Why does patriotic emotion attach itself so fervently to England and not to Britain? If Britain sounds, as it does, colourless and boring, why is that so? And why, on the contrary, is England so glowingly sonorous? And if neither Britain nor England seems to suit, what else should we call it? The United Kingdom, or Britain, which is kind of boring and not helpful, or England, which is poetic but troublesome, or the British Isles, which is too geographical, or this country, which is an all-purpose term used within the family, or this small country of ours, which is weirdly defensively Shakespearean, in order to, well, not untangle Englishness and Britishness, but to make you aware of the distinctness of both terms, I will need to, for some unfortunately, again, historicize a little. And I will do so by starting off on how Britain becomes Britain, why England seems to be its chief puzzle piece, and why this relationship is maybe a little problematic. I will then go on by trying to make plain why even today there is a tad of confusion about what Englishness and Britishness is, and how that to a certain extent plays into current political and social troubles in Great Britain. Trying to narrate a story of Britain is rather more difficult than you might think. Because where do we start? When does Britain start? Does it start in 1603 with the union of the crowns of Scotland and England? Or does it start in 1707 with the Act of Union between Scotland and England? Or perhaps does it start as late as the Act of Union in 1801 with Ireland? Maybe that's, however, too late, and Britain actually starts in 1485 when Henry Tudor ascends to the throne. Or maybe a few years later with the Acts of Union in 1536 and 1542 that together essentially abolished any legal difference between England and Wales. Similarly, its end, if it's actually over, or its breakdown, isn't really definite. So where do we start? And here I'm going to briefly take the long road to Britain, an oxymoron if you've ever heard one. I will start with England's first imperial foray into Wales, as, like scholars have noted, the English Empire began at home. Wales, Williams notes, as a political entity comes into existence as a junior partner in Britain run by England. Wales was the first country to feel the force of English expansion, as, and here I'm going to quote Coomer again, the Welsh were the residues of the original inhabitants of Britain, the people that could call themselves the most truly British, but who eventually found themselves dispersed into separate communities, for instance Welsh and Cornish, and driven to a small corner of the island and fighting an increasingly losing battle for survival. Even their very name was an insult. While they tried to maintain the words Cymru or Cymri, a word that meant people of the same region and could be applied equally to the people and the land, they were called instead Welsh and Wales, both demeaning words that derive from a generic German word for anything foreign. Thus, in their very name, the Welsh accepted that they were someone else's creature, living on the sufferance of a foreign power, basically aliens in their own land. Kumar notes that this imposition of a name from outside was partly their fault. I would sort of argue against it, but agree with him insofar as being governed from outside was at least born out of their political and cultural situation at that very time. And we're of course talking about pre-13th century here. Despite having a very well-defined territory, Wales was and is separated from England by Offa's Dyke, and a clearly defined cultural identity, Wales struggled to achieve political unity, though there was no lack of trying. One example to unite these smaller kingdoms and territories as a united kingdom of Wales came in the mid-13th century. Llywelyn the Great had united most of Wales, and his later successor, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, or in English Llywelyn the Last, was under the agreement of Welsh nobles established as the first Prince of Wales, a title ratified by official treaties with England. This triumph, however, was rather short-lived, as were other unification attempts in Wales, which made Wales particularly vulnerable to English influence. As Llywelyn had seized the land of other Welsh nobles, he had somewhat understandably become rather unpopular, so that during the English invasion under Edward I, the Welsh nobles actually united against Llywelyn and tried to unseat him. Simultaneously, during that invasion, Wales was divided up under English rule, and after Llywelyn's death, the title Prince of Wales was transferred to the later Edward II, and from then on was given to each successive first son of the British royal family. From this point onwards, England and Wales were more or less joined, an intertwinement that became even more firm when Henry VII, a Welshman, ascended the throne in 1485. The Acts of Union in 1536 and in 1543 completed the Anglicisation of Wales that had started with the Edwardian Statute of 1284 and continued steadily thereafter. This shiring of Wales meant that for the first time in its history, there was now a uniform pattern of administration throughout the whole principality, a pattern based on English common law and English justices of the peace. The relationship between England and Wales was even back then characterized by animosity. And here I need to say that I'm of course using English sources, I'm using sources written by English writers, so take that with probably a whole can of salt. So much salt, in fact, that you probably get sodium poisoning. Anyhow, where was I? With the Welsh said to have a natural hatred for the English and being opposed by the power of God and man alike, and are powerless to obtain what they want, they being the Welsh. The sinfulness and the rebelliousness of the Welsh, and to a certain extent the Celtic people, served as a foil which made the identity of the English people it resisted stand out in high relief. These prejudices were part and parcel of the conquest and the colonialization of Wales. The second home invasion of the English came with the conquest and colonialization of Ireland, albeit in an effort that is a lot less clear-cut than the Welsh one. Ireland's situation at that point in time was only a little less precarious than the Welsh situation. Here too, Irish kings had tried to achieve Irish unity, however, again with very little success. Ireland remained fundamentally a series of small kingdoms ruled by leaders who occasionally tried to assert their rule over the whole island by claiming the title of High King, a title which acquired legendary status in Irish history and which became more and more dependent on maintaining one's hold over Dublin. The Irish, who had never been conquered by the Romans and who in the early Middle Ages developed a flourishing artistic and religious culture, through their own political weakness were unable to withstand the power of the English when conquest began in earnest in the late 12th century, namely with the English conquest that changed Irish history, that is, Henry II's invasion of Ireland in 1171, an invasion that brought about internal struggles which eventually ended in the fusion of the crowns, with Henry's son John being awarded the lordship over Ireland. It wasn't until Henry VIII that Ireland was kind of divided from England, making the English king the king of the Kingdom of England and Wales and of Ireland, justified as it was with Wales by the idea that the people were backward and barbarous and needed civilizing, something that sounds a little like the white man's burden at home. England encountered greater resistance, and for a time its success of conquering Ireland hung in balance. Eventually the English were, however, to prevail, but the society they created in Ireland was fundamentally divided and, unlike Wales, never fully integrated into the English system. Moreover, the division between natives and foreigners, fatally confirmed later by religious differences, lasted far longer than in Wales. Similarly, the formal union between the United Kingdom and Ireland comes comparatively late, with the Act of Union in 1801. The situation with England's most northerly neighbour, so to speak, that is Scotland, is, however, markedly different. If conquest and colonialisation fit as a first approximation the fate of the Welsh and the Irish, then the Scottish were mostly Anglicised by stealth. With cat-like tread upon a prey we steal, silence tread, our cautious way we feel. No sound at all, shh, we never speak a word, our flies foot forward steal. While Ireland and Wales were firmly separated from England by either Offa's Dyke or by the sea, it was not quite the case for Scotland. Moreover, while both Wales and Ireland, because of the clear-cut distinction to England, had been able to develop pretty distinct cultural identities, the same could not be said for the neighbour up north. More to the point, it contained such a diversity of ethnicities and territories as to make any definition of Scottishness problematic for centuries to come. However, Scottish kings, most importantly from Malcolm II onwards, managed to create political unity and were able to strengthen the Scottish crown, as well as expand their territory, two advantages that helped Scotland against the relentless expansion of England. Scotland, after its wars of independence, was able to maintain independence. Scottish kings of the 14th and 15th century freely made treaties, often anti-English treaties, with foreign powers. Their church was acknowledged as independent by the papacy, so that, for instance, in the Great Schism, they took different sides from the English. They had their own parliament, their own laws and law courts. Their writers exploited legend to construct a national history that was more venerable, more ancient and more continuous than that of the English. However, while they resisted the English, they also somewhat Englished themselves. At this point in history, English meant mostly French or Anglo-Norman culture. Thus, Scottish kings were also Norman kings. Scottish laws and institutions were largely modelled on English ones. The language of the Scottish courts, Scottish writers, and a good part of the Scottish nation was, when it was not French, a variety of English. The English thus did not need to conquer Scotland. The Scottish simply became more and more similar to England throughout time, through their laws, their language, and throughout intermarriages between Scottish and English nobles. This, however, also led to an interior separation between the lowlands and the highlands, between the civilized, prosperous and English-speaking society of the lowlands and the backward, barbarous, Gaelic-speaking society of the highlands. However, that's a completely different story that I will not get into. Yet these developments also lead, on the one hand, to the intermarriage of Margaret, one of Henry IV's daughters, and James IV of Scotland, which set up the succession of James V of Scotland to the British throne and the subsequent union of the crowns in 1603. By this point, James became King James I of England, Wales and Ireland, and King James V of Scotland. In his efforts to symbolically unite the crowns, he devised, for instance, a new coat of arms, as well as a new uniform coinage. Flags and coats of arms that were greeted rather unenthusiastically, with each new design mostly offending either party. Nonetheless, a new Union flag was proclaimed in 1606. But it would take some time, generally seen as until the Act of Union in 1707, until, for instance, ships would fly not distinct flags, that is the English or the Scottish, but that would fly actually the Union flag. And maybe as a side note, here we're not quite talking about the Union Jack, we're talking about a similar flag that does not include Ireland as of this point. Now, why have I spent so much time, probably far too much time, to tell you about how England basically invaded the British Isles in a fit of absence of mind? Well, what should have become clear by now is that England, as we know or perceive it, has never been just England. It's been an amalgamation of various people, from Roman invaders to Anglo-Saxons to Britons, and with each step of its expansion and each integration of different territories, England shifted from being just England.
I'm just Harry. Just Harry.
To being England and instead of being a mosaic, Britain and England rather became a painting in which the colours run into one another and overlap. Britishness was derived from a political context following the Union of the Crowns and the Act of Union with Scotland, as well as other colonial and unifying endeavours in order to legitimise the new state in the face of possible threats from social and nationalist sources. It was superimposed over and developed and transformed by the citizens of the United Kingdom. Now, Britain is, first of all, an ancient and first and foremost a practical term that was used in order to reduce the alienation that people might have felt after or during England's imperial strife. We, again, need to keep in mind that before Britain, it's simply four pretty much distinct nations under one crown. However, there was nothing to properly unite them as of yet, meaning that nothing could be celebrated, nothing was ritualized, nothing was there that everyone could benefit and profit from. The term Britain was first recorded by the Greeks in the 4th century BC as the name of the Celts who lived on Western Europe's largest offshore island. And while the Romans adapted its Greek roots and called the island Britannia, the Angles and the Saxons named the land they invaded and eventually settled in England and basically ignored the rest. Britain as a designation, however, always persisted, but it was rarely used until about the time of Henry VIII and Edward VI, when it came again into practical politics in connections with the efforts to unite England and Scotland. Despite the union of the crowns in 1603, when James I proclaimed himself the King of Great Britain, efforts to promote Britain as an overarching identity appear to have had limited success until the Act of Union union with Scotland in 1707, which established the United Kingdom of Great Britain. From that time onwards, Britain came into common usage as a shorthand for Great Britain. It figured widely in official and semi-official economia to the kingdom, for instance in its perhaps most celebrated form by poet James Thomson, who wrote, As such, even if there were efforts to infuse Britain with a certain note of warmth, it remained largely a political umbrella term, a term which promoted an identity that rested on common experiences of monarchy, economic opportunity, and religion. The empire and the British expansion became the crux of the matter. But underneath this umbrella, ethnic identities and national identities of Scotland, Ireland and Wales remained nonetheless. And after the dissolution of most of its empire, these identities also gained more and more strength, something which led to increasing efforts to break away from Britain, which also brings us back to England. What about England and Englishness? I haven't really talked about it. I've spent much time talking about Wales, about Ireland, about Scotland, but I really haven't spent any time talking about England as of yet. The factors that construct Englishness, if we talk about nation states, it's of course ethnicity, history, cultural heritage, and so on. The factors are nonetheless much more elusive for researchers and scholars. As Kumar notes, one of the differences between Englishness and Britishness can be attributed to the fact that the second one, Britishness, is an artificial and multinational identity, which lacks the warmth and the emotive quality of a more exclusive national identity that is based on ethnicity, place of birth and parentage. Generally, as Raphael Samuel notes, Englishness has all kinds of pleasant connotations, as it evokes a people rather than a state. William Blake's Jerusalem rather than Westminster, Whitehall or Balmoral. Because of its association with the language, it is tied to English literature. Because of its subliminal association with the countryside, the real England, it conjures up images of rusticity. English is smaller and gentler than British. British is an altogether more uncomfortable term to work with, hard rather than soft, and belonging to a specific historical epoch rather than the timelessness of tradition. It is a political identity which derives its legitimacy from the expansion of the nation-state. Its associations are diplomatic and military rather than literary, imperial rather than or as well as domestic. Compared with English, it is formal, abstract and remote. While British, of course, allows for a more pluralistic understanding of the nation, one which sees it as a citizenry rather than a folk, and is therefore more hospitable and open to newcomers and outsiders. English, however, presupposes a common heritage, a distinct cultural identity. And Krishan Kumar asserts that the empire was a key component to both Englishness and Britishness. Thus, if Britain's primary identity was to be an imperial one, then the English were put firmly and forever in their place, reduced to a component part of a much greater whole. Since the British Isles were governed by the English language, English law, English culture, and English political institutions, the English were those who ran the show, and they did not need to stress their hegemonic position too often and too insistently. And indeed, it can be argued that in Britain, Englishness was for the longest time the dominant identity, the common sense identity. And as noted previously, Dominant identities are rarely problematic or mentioned up until the point when they are under threat. However, as Kumar also notes, nowadays more and more people seem to be searching for England and thus for a distinctive English identity. The motivation for research and the growing self-consciousness of the English can be largely contributed to the breakup of the identity's main component, that is the empire, the ongoing process of devolution within the UK, which results in stronger subnational governing bodies, as well as a re-emergence of strong national identities such as Scottishness and Welshness, which in turn challenge an identity largely defined by the empire and by commerce, and lastly, of course, by globalization and multiculturalism. As a result, England sees a renewed interest in its southern countryside and the characteristics of landscape and forms of rural life, as the essential England was a rural one, as it was there, not in the cities, that the English virtues were seen to be their best and most typical. The Englishmen in correlation were perceived as practical, individualistic, eccentric, amateurs, craftsmen, inventors, industrialists. It was this England, an England of the poets, domestic, sporting, gallant, boyish, of a sure and delicate heart, with the countryside at its centre, which became the emblem of a certain kind of Englishness, promoting a very much touristic picture of England. Now, what are the takeaways from this little, somewhat overly long trek through English history? First of all, to make you aware that British and English are often indistinguishable, because there has been a very long tradition of English imperialism, which in turn has shaped how A, England saw itself, and B, how Englishness was and would be shaped by the amassing of home and overseas territories. Moreover, while history is often considered somewhat kind of boring, it also provides us not only with a broad overview over social, political and cultural developments, but in this very case shows us the foundational basis for persisting problems at the very moment in time that we live in. Whether it's the problematic relationship with Wales, which has resulted in strong nationalistic and independence movements in Wales that laud their language and their culture and heritage, or the independence movements in Scotland that have become even more pronounced since the Brexit and the referendum of 2014, or even Brexit itself, most, if not all of these occurrences have often been simmering underneath the surface of Britishness and of British history. And with the erosion of the empire and the now potential dissolution of Britain, these ideas of independence, of national identity, of cultural and ethnic identity are bound to gain even more momentum. Second, that imperialism isn't just a historical event or epoch, but that imperialism is both the founding stone and a cornerstone of Englishness and Britishness. While overseas territories were diverse and particularly un-English, they were nonetheless regarded as one people and one family, as a great homogeneous people, one in blood, language, religion and laws, but dispersed over a boundless space. A sentiment that was also expressed in many forms, from royal speeches stressing that all peoples are being reached and that the Commonwealth is part of a family, to politicians stressing a united Britain as a bulwark to undemocratic forces, all notions that infused Britain with an emotional power, in that authority and formal control over people was joined to experiences of face-to-face control each person has felt very deeply within, for instance, the family, thus affecting them in an intimate way and making this form of authority very, very effective. Third, that the breakaway and breakup of such defining features and the lack of distinctness between Britain and England due to the cultural and political control that England has held over Britain has led to a climate of uncertainty of what England actually is. An uncertainty that has found expression in A, search for a distinct Englishness, in B, a need to define said Englishness, and, as is the case with most identity constructions and identities under threat, see an increased movement towards clearly distinguishing themselves from others, the latter of which has had numerous far-reaching consequences which we have and will probably witness in the future. Okay, wir nehmen einfach mal auf, weil dann kann ich nämlich sehen, ob ich mich selbst noch sehe und ob ich auch noch scharf bin. Es ist mit Abstand das Merkwürdigste, was man sagen kann. And why is that always on camera? Okay, gut. Nun ja. Wir haben uns heute wieder sehr britisch angezogen. Passt zum Thema. Fantastisch. Gut. Okay. Right. I sound like Stephen Fry. Good.
I see, right. Well, let's hope no one calls this programme a load of sloblock.
In the way we talk about it, as well as in the way we imagine both nations. Das ist aber ein confusing Satz. Was habe ich denn da geschrieben? Wieder endlos lang? Schön, toll. And yet it is there are no, and that is not to mean that there are no symbols of where am I? Symbols of Englishness, Britishness. Bäh. I have confused myself. Good. Okay. Exploitative employees and employers, of course. Exploitative employees. Ganz kurz umändern. Again. Ich kann das auch nicht lesen, weil ich blind wie ein Maulwurf bin, trotz Brille. Warum singe ich das eigentlich? Und jetzt ist das auch noch schief. Naja, das hatten wir ja schon mehrfach. Ich glaube, das sollte der Titel dieses Seminars sein. How to do it really badly, actually. Das funktioniert ja heute richtig brillant, muss ich sagen. Also ich muss sagen, das ist bisher so die beste Aufnahme. Nicht, dass ich ja überhaupt sonst wie lange an diesem Scheiß sitze. Nein. Ja, jetzt kann ich es wenigstens lesen. Sehr schön. Ja, die Pest. Driven into small Das gibt's doch nicht. Was ist denn das für ein Satz? Der ist 10 Zeilen lang. Was habe ich mir denn dabei gedacht? The Welsh were twere so simple.
Would that it were so simple.
Would that it were so simple.
My dear boy, why do you say that? Why do you say twere?
The English invasion under Edward I. Is it Edward I or Henry? Warte mal, da war doch irgendjemand, der Schottland nicht macht. Das ist, glaube ich, auch Edward. Was hat dieser Mann eigentlich alles gemacht? Hat der nichts anderes zu tun? Wahrscheinlich auf seinem Thron gesessen und sich gedacht, was mache ich heute? Wales einnehmen. Was mache ich morgen? Schottland einnehmen. Henry war der mit Irland. Naja, klar, okay. Was ist William, Henry, Stephen, Henry, Richard, John, Henry, Edward, Sean, Henry, John. Ja doch, das müsste Henry sein. Anyhow. Even more firm when Henry II, also diese Könige hier, kannst du ja eigentlich nur die Frauen merken, sind wenigstens ein bisschen anders. Ja, heißen alle Henry oder Edward. Die keinen anderen Namen. Würfelspiel. Wie nennen wir unser Kind? Henry oder Edward? Wir nennen ihn Henry Edward. So ein bisschen wie Fitzwilliam. Ich konnte mich nicht entscheiden, welcher Name. Machen wir beide draus. Of Margaret, one of Henry, of absence of mind. Well, I need to scroll. Otherwise, where am I? Only half. Okay. As the name of the Celts that lived on Western Europe's largest offshore island. Iceland, ja genau. Weder Ireland noch Iceland, but Great Britain. It figured wildly. It figured which derives its heute gebe ich es echt ein bisschen auf. Was ist denn heute los? Also wirklich. Erst mit dem Licht, jetzt mit dem Text. Was habe ich denn hier für einen Scheiß zusammengeschrieben? Okay, stehe ich immer noch in Fokus? Ja.